Welcome. Today we will be discussing the largest Confederate surrender of the Civil War. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of or been to Bennett Place Historic Site in North Carolina. Okay, a few of you. Until last April, when traveling in North Carolina, I had never heard of this surrender. Most people have heard about the surrender of Appomattox and believe that was the end of the war, when really it lasted longer than that. Before we discuss the events that took place at Bennett Place in 1865, let us get some background with events leading up to it. Generals Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant met at the home of Wilmer McLean to discuss the surrender of Lee's men to Grant. Wilmer McLean was not a stranger to the Civil War troops. At the beginning of the war, he lived in Manassas, Virginia. This would be the site of the first battle of the war. Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard used McLean's farmhouse as his headquarters. Much like Lee and Grant met, they used his house to talk surrender terms. The Appomattox terms would parole officers and enlist men, but required all Confederate military equipment be relinquished. The discussion between the generals then drifted into military prospects for peace, but Lee, once again taking the lead, asked Grant to put his terms in writing. When Grant finished, he handed the terms to his former adversary, and Lee quietly looked them over. When finished reading, he remarked, "This will have a very happy effect on my army." Lee asked if the terms allowed his men to keep their horses. The Confederate Army men owned their mounts. The animals were needed to farm once they returned to civilian life. Grant responded that he would not change the terms as written, which had no provisions allowing private soldiers to keep their mounts, but would order his officers to allow any Confederate claiming a horse or mule to keep it. General Lee agreed that this concession would go a long way toward promoting healing. When Lee mentioned that his men had been without rations for several days, the Union commander arranged for 25,000 rations to be sent to the hungry Confederates. After formal copies of the surrender terms and Lee's acceptance had been drafted and exchanged, the meeting ended. Battle of Bentonville, North Carolina. This battle was the last largest engagement of the war. It was also the first time Joseph Johnston and William Sherman met each other on the battlefield, but it would not be the last. The battle took place March 19th through the 21st, 1865, and it was a Union victory. On March 19th, Union Major General Henry Slocum encounters the men under General Joseph Johnston. There were 5 different attacks on the Union troops, but the Confederates were unable to dismantle the men, and the first day of the battle was over. On March 20th, 1865, little skirmishing took place, and Sherman allowed Johnston to retreat. On March 21st, Johnston remained while he removed his wounded. Skirmishing heated up along the entire front. In the afternoon, Joseph Mower led his Union division along a narrow trace that carried it across Mill Creek into Johnston's rear. Confederate counterattacks stopped Mower's advance, saving the Army's only line of communication and retreat. Mower withdrew, ending fighting for the day. During the night, Johnston retreated across the bridge at Bentonville. Union forces pursued at first light, driving back Joseph Wheeler's cavalry rear guard and saving the bridge. Federal pursuit was halted at Hannah's Creek after a severe skirmish. Sherman, after regrouping at Goldsboro, pursued Johnston toward Raleigh, North Carolina. P.G.T. Beauregard met with President Davis prior to the surrender at Appomattox in Greensboro, North Carolina. Beauregard told Davis that he deemed it his duty to prepare the president for the inevitable, but this did not convince Davis that the war was lost. He remained optimistic. President Jefferson Davis meets with his cabinet, Joseph Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard. Once Johnston arrived, President Davis told the men of his plans to bring deserters and shirkers back and raise a large field army once again. Once Secretary of War John C. Breckinridge arrived with news of Lee's surrender, the mood of the men changed, all except Davis still. Of course, we all feel the magnitude of the moment. The last disasters are terrible, but I do not think we should regard them as fatal. I think we can whip the enemy yet if our people will turn out. We must look at matters calmly, however, and see what is left for us to do. Whatever can be done must be done at once. We have not a day to lose. Davis did not want anyone to agree with them, but simply wanted them to follow orders and try to reorganize for an attack. Joseph Johnston replied to Davis, noting that the Union outnumbered his men 18-1. All the ammunition they had left was in their guns because the Confederacy lacked the funds and supplies to make more. Any fighting would complete the devastation of the South without hurting the enemy more. He urged the president to open negotiation talks to end the war, and this would be the beginning of the negotiations between Joseph Johnston of the Confederate Army and William T. Sherman of the Union Army. James and Nancy Bennett lived in Durham Station, North Carolina. The family name was originally spelled with an I instead of an E. They had 3 children, Alfonso, Lorenzo, and Eliza. Like many families, the Bennett sons joined the Army. Lorenzo and Alfonso were both members of the 27th North Carolina. Lorenzo would die of pneumonia in 1862 while still in training. Alfonso also died during the war. Their daughter Eliza married a man named Robert Duke. He too was in the war. He would die at a Confederate hospital. Their house was built in 1846. On April 17, 1865, Sherman and Johnston met under a flag of truce and traveled to a nearby farmhouse that had been located. Like Appomattox, the 2 generals would use the home as a place to discuss surrender terms. William Tecumseh Sherman was born February 18, 1820 in Lancaster, Ohio. He was one of 11 children. His father, a Ohio Supreme Court judge, died in 1829, so the family lived with Senator Thomas Ewing, who obtained an appointment for William to the United States Military Academy. In 1840, Sherman would graduate from the academy, 6th in his class. Sherman was superintendent of the Louisiana Military Academy in 1859. At the outbreak of the Civil War, he resigned from the academy and headed north and was made a colonel of the 13th United States Infantry. Sherman said this of the war: "I am tired and sick of war. Its glory is all moonshine. It is only those who have neither fired a shot nor heard the shrieks and groans of the wounded who cry aloud for blood, for vengeance, for desolation. War is hell." William T. Sherman's younger brother, John Sherman, was a close friend of James A. Garfield, and it was he who Garfield went to the 1880 Republican Convention to nominate for president. William T. Sherman was nicknamed Uncle Billy by his army. Joseph Eggleston Johnston was born February 3, 1807 in Farmville, Virginia. In 1829, Joseph graduated from West Point, ranking 13th out of 46 cadets. He was appointed to 2nd lieutenant in the 4th United States Artillery. When Virginia seceded, Johnston was the highest-ranking U.S. Army officer to resign his commission. He was appointed brigadier general. Johnston's weak offensive strategy and caution caused President Davis to remove him from command in July of 1864. After much public clamor, Davis reinstated him as a commander of a loosely collected department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. They were undermanned and undersupplied, but still had some short-lived success at Bentonville. The men of the Confederacy nicknamed Joseph Johnston Old Joe. At the Bennett Place surrender, Johnston was 58 and Sherman was 45. Johnston wore a crisp gray dress uniform buttoned up to the neck. Sherman wore a blue coat that was crumpled and unbuttoned, showing a vest underneath. Johnston had a neatly trimmed mustache and a goatee, but had gray hair that was balding. Sherman's auburn hair was disheveled, and he had a salt and pepper beard. According to reporter O.F. Howe, Sherman was quite cheerful and at his ease, having the air of one who felt himself undoubtedly master of the situation. Howe said this about Johnston: whereas Johnston appeared quite haggard and careworn. On April 12th, although President Davis thought it futile to negotiate with the enemy, he dictated a letter to Sherman. Johnston received Sherman's response to the letter about beginning talks. On April 17, 1865, General Sherman is headed towards Durham Station, North Carolina, by train when he is stopped by the telegraph operator. Sherman is handed a telegraph that would change the upcoming negotiations between himself and Johnston. The telegraph read, Major General Sherman, commanding, President Lincoln was murdered about 10 o'clock last night in his private box at Ford's Theater in this city by an assassin who shot him through the head with a pistol ball. The assassin of the president leaped from the box, brandishing a dagger, exclaiming, Sic semper tyrannis, and that now Virginia was revenged. Mr. Lincoln fell senseless from his seat and continued in the state until 22 minutes after 7 o'clock, at which time he breathed his last. Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War. Sherman forbade the telegraph operator to tell anyone what he had read until his return. The generals were to meet with each other near Durham Station, North Carolina. During the Battle of Bentonville, Sherman was asked what he had thought of Johnston, and his reply, Johnston and I are not on speaking terms. That was about to change when the two met under flags of truce for the first time. Major George W. Nichols, Sherman's adjutant, said this of the first meeting. As General Sherman rode past his picket lines upon that sunny spring morning, the ear was not pained by the moans and cries of mangled men, but the fresh breeze came laden with the fragrance of pines, of apple blossoms, of lilacs, rose, and violets. The eye rested upon 1,000 forms of beauty, for the rains and warm sun had quickened into life countless buds and flowering plants until the hillsides and the glens and bushes were brilliant in their robes of delicate green. The scene was symbolic of the new era of peace then just beginning to dawn upon the nation. They met at noon on April 17, 1865, and Sherman asked about a place they could meet in private. Johnston and his men had passed a farm on Hillsborough Road as they approached the meeting spot. The two men rode to the Bennett farm and knocked on the door. James and Nancy Bennett agreed to let the men meet. The generals and staff tied their horses under a large white oak tree next to the home. Major John Johnson of Johnston's staff wrote in his diary, the flags of the cavalry escorts met at 12 p.m. 10 miles east of Hillsborough at Bennett's house, 5 miles west of Durham Station, North Carolina Railroad. Johnston and Sherman met inside the home in the largest of 3 rooms. It was furnished with a small secretary, 2 single beds, and a table and chairs. And that's a picture of that meeting for the first time. After entering the farmhouse, General Sherman showed General Johnston the telegraph he had received at the train station. Sherman would later write of Johnston's reaction to the news of the assassination. The perspiration came out in large drops on his forehead, and he did not attempt to conceal his distress. Reportedly, Johnston said he believed the event was the greatest possible calamity to the South. Sherman did not want to tell the troops too soon about President Lincoln because he thought it would incite more fighting between the two sides. While in their meeting, they discussed crafting terms that would encompass all remaining Confederate armies. Johnston believed he could get authority from President Davis to surrender all Confederate troops. After 2 hours of conversation, the generals ended the first day. They agreed to meet again the next day at the Bennett farm. After the meeting, Special Field Orders Number 56 was released to Sherman's troops, and it was told of the assassination of President Lincoln. In part it read, Your General, Sherman, does not wish you to infer that this is universal, for he knows that the greatest mass of the Confederate Army would scorn to sanction such acts, but he believes in the legitimate consequence of rebellion against rightful authority. On this day, the second meeting, Sherman and Johnston met again in the home of Nancy and James Bennett. Johnston requested that Confederate General John C. Breckinridge be present during the day's meeting. At first, Sherman wasn't convinced because Breckinridge was a member of Davis's cabinet, but after Johnston pointed out that he had been in the war, Sherman agreed. Before their meeting started, General Sherman offered the other gentlemen a drink of bourbon. Yes, but gentlemen, it occurred to me that perhaps you were not overstocked with liquor, and I procured some medical stores on my way over. Will you join me before we begin work? Postmaster General John Reagan of the Confederacy had written out terms that Johnston believed were all well thought out. These terms were the disbanding of Confederate forces, the continuation of state governments, the preservation of people's rights, personal and political, freedom from future prosecution or penalty due to their involvement in the war, and agreement to a general suspension of hostilities pending these negotiations. After reading these terms, Sherman wrote out a set of terms he believed were good enough that President Lincoln would have approved if he were living. While Johnston and Breckinridge read the paper, Sherman drank more bourbon without offering any. Breckinridge said took this as an insult, saying, "General Sherman is a hog. Yes, sir, a hog. Did you see him take that drink by himself? No Kentucky gentleman would ever have taken away that bottle. He knew we needed it and needed it badly." After reading the terms, Private Arthur Granger of the 15th Pennsylvania Cavalry was asked to write 2 drafts, and Major Henry Hitchcock proofread them. The terms written by Sherman far exceeded the terms Grant gave to Lee at Appomattox, and were even more generous than what Reagan had provided. Sherman wrote after the terms, "It was designed to be and so expressed on its face as a mere basis for reference to the President of the United States and constitutional commander-in-chief to enable him, if he chose, at one blow to dissipate the military power of the Confederacy, which had threatened the national safety for years." While these terms were sent off to be looked at by both sides, President Johnson and President Davis, the armies were in a truce with no fighting happening. Theo Davis, an artist from Harper's Weekly, was asked by the generals to sketch their conference prosperity. They sat down at the table Sherman used to write the accord, and this is the picture he drew on the screen. Many years after the war, Johnston visited Theo Davis's gallery and said that people would think the bottle on the table was his whiskey bottle. When asked about the bottle later, Sherman said it was good whiskey, some of my own. The meeting of the second day was over, and the men once again departed for their own headquarters. Lieutenant General Stephen D. Lee read the terms aloud, and as he did so, the tears which had been gathering in Johnston's eyes burst bounds and trickled down his cheeks. Lee asked if the terms would be agreed upon in Washington, D.C., and Johnston was told by Sherman that the terms were ones Lincoln would have agreed upon, so he thought he was acting in good faith. It was now a waiting game for both sides as the terms had been sent off to the officials to agree or disagree with. Sherman reviewed the troops. After hearing about the surrender of Johnston, a member of the 10th Ohio Cavalry wrote in his diary, "What will we do next?" And that was a good question. What would they do after being away from home for so long? On the Confederacy side, morale was low, if not non-existent already. The meeting between General Sherman and myself and the armistice that followed produced great uneasiness in the Army, Johnston wrote. On April 17th, an entire brigade and another regiment of Mississippians deserted. I went to the 1st Consolidated Arkansas Regiment on dress parade, as I thought it would be my last opportunity to see a Confederate regiment on dress parade. As I thought of the past and looked into the future, I could scarcely keep back the tears, written by a soldier in his diary. Colonel J. Fred Waring, a Georgia commander of the Jeff Davis, Legion Cavalry, wrote, "We shall be betrayed by our own leaders." And this is a copy of the terms, the first set of terms on the screen here. On April 21st, 1865, Major Hitchcock arrived in Washington with the terms Sherman had sent with him. He tells his uncle, President Johnson would not approve or carry out certain points submitted to him. General Grant forwards the package to Secretary of War Stanton. They are of such importance that I think immediate action should be taken on them, and that it should be done by the President in council with his whole cabinet. Stanton says upon receiving the package, the cabinet met to discuss the terms, and General Grant was invited to read it to them. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles later wrote, among the cabinet and all present, there was but one mind on this subject. The plan was rejected and Sherman's agreements disapproved. On April 23rd at 8 p.m., Sherman cables Johnston this message. Major Hitchcock reports his arrival at Morehead City with dispatches from Washington and will be here in the morning. Please be in readiness to resume negotiations when the contents of dispatch are known. General Sherman doesn't know that his terms have been rejected and the truce is going to be lifted soon. President Johnson and his cabinet meet in Washington to discuss and debate the terms that General Sherman has given to General Johnston. After this meeting has taken place, General Grant is tasked with the duty of telling Sherman his terms were rejected. After Grant arrives at Durham Station, North Carolina, he tells Sherman that the only authorized terms to be given were the same terms given to Lee at Appomattox. General Grant does not want to be involved in any of the negotiations, so he arrives in secret and tries to stay away from the army in North Carolina. The manner in which he was criticized for his actions was put in paper for all to see. Edwin Stanton is outraged and immediately rejects the terms. Some of the reasons for his rejections are, 1, it would enable the rebels to reestablish slavery in the southern states. 2, it granted terms that had been deliberately, repeatedly, and solemnly rejected by President Lincoln, and better terms than the rebels had ever asked in their most prosperous condition. After writing out his reasons for rejecting these terms, Stanton sent them to the New York Times to be published, and on April 23, 1865, they were. Upon learning that his terms were rejected and that Edwin Stanton had ridiculed him in the newspaper, General Sherman in part said, It does seem strange to me that every barroom loafer in New York can read in the morning journals official matter that is withheld from a general whose command extends from Kentucky to North Carolina. Once Sherman knew of the terms being rejected, he notified General Johnston about an end to the truce the armies were in. I am instructed to limit my operations to your immediate command and not to attempt civil negotiations. I therefore demand the surrender of your army on the same terms that were given General Lee at Appomattox of April 9th, instant, purely, and simple. Edwin Stanton allowed Major General Henry Halleck to prepare an order to Generals Meade, Sheridan, Wright, who were all commanders in Virginia. The order advised to pay no regard to any truce or orders of General Sherman suspending hostilities on the ground that Sherman's agreements could bind his command only and no other. This order would offend Sherman, and he would never forgive Halleck for issuing it. Peter Eltridge from New York, who was serving with Sherman's army, was one of the few who did not support the general. I was never more surprised in my life when I read the agreement that Sherman had made with Johnston, and which he even dared to send to Washington for approval. I cannot account for the strange conduct of General Sherman. He has certainly lowered himself much in the opinion of the whole army and a majority of loyal citizens. The credit and renown that he had won by his great campaign has nearly all been lost by his attempting to make himself a great peacemaker. General Sherman, still upset over what was written about him in the newspaper, wrote to both Stanton and Grant expressing his anger. On the other side of the surrender terms, we find that on April 24th, 1865, President Davis approves the terms sent to him. Your action is approved. We will soon inform General Sherman, and if the like authority be given by the government of the United States to complete the arrangement, you will proceed on the basis adopted. On April 26th at 1:30 a.m., Johnston advised Davis that he had written Sherman to request a meeting to discuss surrendering his command, even if he did not have the Confederate president's permission. Once again, the two generals found themselves at the Bennett family home. The meeting was due to start at noon, but due to an accident, Johnston could not show up until 2 hours later. Once introductions were made, once again, the two men retired into the house to begin discussions. Sherman offered the Appomattox terms once again, but in person this time, and Johnston believed that those terms weren't good enough, and Sherman agreed additional terms may be needed, but worried anything other than what he was told would be rejected. Major General Schofield accompanied Sherman to the meeting on the 26th. At length, I was summoned to their presence and informed in substance that they were unable to arrange the terms of capitulation to their satisfaction. Schofield suggested writing two documents. One would have only the Appomattox terms, and the other would include those terms and also address Johnston's concerns. The generals agreed and signed the first terms that Schofield wrote out. Private Arthur Granger of the 15th Pennsylvania Cavalry again was tasked by Sherman to make copies. The additional terms were also okayed by the civil authorities in D.C. Joseph Johnston surrendered nearly 90,000 Confederate soldiers located in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Johnston was convinced it would be the greatest of human crimes to continue the war. He disobeyed Jefferson Davis's orders when he surrendered. Once the surrender was final, James Bennett and his family were asked to join in a toast by the generals. Schofield was able to arrange for 250,000 rations to be given to Johnston's armies, that is 10 days' worth for 25,000 men. A rebel said this of Sherman after the surrender: I do not think Sherman was as mean as he had been pictured, for he gave us our horses and sidearms and every fourth man ammunition and told us to go home and go to work. When one soldier heard about the surrender, he wrote this in his diary: We built a great big fire that threw our shadow out into the moonlight. We chased one another through the bushes, some risk of scratching their bare shins on the knots. They shook the branches and played squirrel. One of them put on his accoutrements and went through the manual of arms. All of these things were done after we had shouted ourselves hoarse. When we had got fairly tired out, we went to bed and dreamed of home. A soldier from Illinois remembered, at dark the train returns, and General Blair gives the news that Johnston has surrendered unconditionally his army with the states of Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. The rejoicing in the 17th Corps is intense, for though it is ready to fight to the death, it felt that a further effusion of blood would be a useless sacrifice. As far as the troops in the field were concerned, the war was over and it was time for them to go home. But General Halleck was still giving orders not to adhere to the surrender. Generals Meade, Sheridan, and Wright are acting under orders to pay no regard to any truce or orders of General Sherman suspending hostilities, on the ground that Sherman's agreements could bind his command only and no other. The same night, April 26th, General Grant heard about Halleck giving these orders and responded immediately. General Johnston surrendered the forces under his command, embracing for all from here to the Chattahoochee to General Sherman on the basis agreed upon between General Lee and myself for the Army of Virginia. Once President Davis realized that General Johnston was going to disobey orders and surrender the army, he fled. He had hoped to meet his wife in South Carolina and travel west and continue fighting the war. Johnston and Beauregard resented how Davis had treated them. The fact is patent that the Confederate government, or those who formally constituted it, abandoned General Johnston and Beauregard and the forces under them in their extremity without advice or instruction, Colonel Alfred Roman wrote, who was Beauregard's nephew. On April 27, 1865, was a turning point in the country now that General Johnston had surrendered his troops in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. The general commanding announces a further suspension of hostilities and a final agreement with General Johnston, which terminates the war as to the armies under his command and the country east of the Chattahoochee. This was part of the telegram that Sherman published for his Union Army. Sherman then sent this letter to General Johnston in good faith and said farewell. General Johnston wrote to his troops that hostilities with the North were over and the soldiers were not allowed to take up arms against their enemy. Part of his letter to the troops read, "Events in Virginia, which broke every hope of success by war, imposed on its general the duty of sparing the blood of this gallant army and saving our country from further devastation and our people from ruin." Paroling of the officers and soldiers began. A Texas regiment signed parole papers and were given $1 in silver. Another Texas regiment, the 8th, surrendered at Greensboro. 90 men were present that morning. It started out with nearly 1,200. The 104th OVI was tasked with serving as provost marshals for the stacking of arms and paroling of Johnston's army in Greensboro. Paroles started on May 1st, 1865. A northern newspaper accurately published, "With this surrender, the formidable military organization of the rebellion is extinguished and is truly, indeed, may be regarded the final end of the war as rapidly approaching." At that time, nearly 16,000 men remained with Johnston's army. The first person to sign his parole was a man named Raphael Semmes. After 4 long years of bloody conflict, we lay down our arms, horns blowing and drums beating. Cease. Hezekiah M. Corkle, a Confederate soldier, wrote. As I said earlier, soldiers were given $1 in silver for their service. Captain W.E. Stoney said, "I shall have mine made into a medal to keep and value as received from the dying hands of my government." Many of the Confederate soldiers had resigned themselves to the fact that the war was over and they were going to be paroled out of service. Some of the soldiers were embarrassed that they had to go through the process of being paroled. I never felt so mortified in my life as this morning when I went into the presence of the Yankee officers to sign my parole, Colonel Walker wrote. Here's a remark Private Sam Watkins said of the regimental flag. A mere squad of noble and brave men gathered around the tattered flag that they had followed in every battle through that long war. It was so bullet-riddled and torn that it was a few blue and red shreds that hung drooping, while it too was stacked with our guns forever. By May 2nd, 1865, about 32,000 Confederate soldiers had been paroled. The Union Army was going to have a grand review of the troops. On May 23rd, the Army of the Potomac would walk down the streets of D.C. before many Army officials. On May 24th, all the Western Army troops were given their chance to walk before Army officials. The Confederate president was still convinced that his army could have won the war even after the North Carolina surrender. The dispersion of Lee's army and the surrender of the remnant which remained with him destroyed the hopes I entertained when we parted. Had that army held together, I'm now confident that we would have been today on the high road to independence. Even after that disaster, if the men who struggled, say 30 or 40,000 in number, had come back with their arms and disposition to fight, we might have repaired the damage, but all was sadly the reverse of that. Davis didn't think Johnston and Beauregard were fast enough in gathering Lee's men after Appomattox and joining those men and their current troops to fight against Sherman. Years after the war, Davis said General Lee was compelled to surrender. General Johnston consented to surrender. Major General Joseph Wheeler defended both generals, saying this: the compulsion of Lee by Grant on April 9th preceded and actually added to the compulsion of Johnston by Sherman April 26th. The privilege of consent was never allowed by the enemy to either, nor was there ground to charge against the Confederate generals that one, more than the other, would have consented in advance of the extremity of compulsion. Years after the war's end, the two generals, Johnston and Sherman, had great respect towards each other. This is evident when Joseph Johnston is a pallbearer for William Sherman. In February 1891, in New York, Joseph Johnston stood outside in the rain without his hat. A bystander said he should put his hat on. Joseph Johnston replied, "If I were in his place and he were standing here in mine, he would not put on his hat." 10 days later, February 24th, 1891, Johnston died of pneumonia. And this is a parole paper. In 1865, the Bennett farm was 350 acres. By 1870, the farm was making money by growing and selling apples, potatoes, and seed corn. The family also made money by selling parts of their land. While the two generals were inside meeting over the surrender, Union soldiers were outside, and they took strawberry and cherry blossoms off trees, as well as pieces from privet bushes were taken as souvenirs. Those men were not the only individuals that took things from the home. Journalist William Anderson reported that the Bennett house is being carried off piecemeal, and in due time there will be an excavation to mark the spot where the disappearing Bennett cottage now stands. Private Arthur Granger of the 15th Pennsylvania Cavalry was tasked by Sherman to make copies. My share of the surrender was the pen and holder and inkstand, which I still possess. I tried to purchase from Mr. Bennett the table cover on which the writing was done, but the old fellow could not induce to part with it. After the war was over, General Sherman did in fact give the pen and inkstand to Granger. On April 28, 1865, Captain William H. Day sent a detail to the home to get the drop leaf table and its cover. Bennett was offered $10 for it by the Union and a first-rate horse. He took the money and the horse, but never received the said horse from Day. Years later, he sought restitution for the table and other stolen items. In 1873, Bennett even went as far as to petition the Southern Claims Commission, but they barred his claim because he supported the Confederacy. In the end, he never received any compensation for his table, which was such an important part in history. James Bennett would die in 1878 and his wife Nancy in 1884. Elizabeth Ann Bennett lived on the property after her parents' death. Her daughter Roberta and husband J.M. Shields would acquire the land. In 1889, the couple sold the property to Brodie Duke, Roberta's cousin, but the house stood vacant. In 1890, Brodie Duke would recognize that the farm had historical significance. He offered it for sale at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. No one wanted to buy the property, so Brodie sold the last 35 acres to a local farmer named Samuel Morgan, and he intended to make it a historical attraction, but died before it came to fruition. By 1905, The dwelling had almost collapsed. The grounds were littered with debris from the falling structures, and any glimmer of its once significant past was all but gone. In 1980, archaeological report said, the original 1846 structure burned to the ground in 1921. A local attorney, R.O. Everett, and a state legislator, Frank L. Fuller, began the process to turn Bennett Place into an attraction. They requested if the state of North Carolina would maintain the site and contribute towards a monument if the Morgan family would donate the land. All parties agreed, and the 35 acres were deeded to the Bennett Place Memorial Commission. A unique monument was built on the property and is called the Unity Monument, which is 2 granite columns representing the North and the South. And that's pictured on the left, right there. And Unity is written right here. You can't really see it, but the top is inscribed Unity. This monument was dedicated November 1923, despite negativity. In 1930, a stone wall was built around the property, but there was a lack of interest to continue any further renovations. In 1958, Mrs. Magruder Dent donated $8,000 to the site. Her grandfather was part of Joseph Johnston's army. The Unity Monument was the only structure in 1959. If you can see, there's a brick fireplace there. And so it's right here. You can't really see it right here though, but it's the original one that survived the fire. The Bennett Place Commission deeded the property to the North Carolina Department of Archives and History, which planned to redevelop the site as a significant attraction in time for the 100th anniversary of the surrender. Using old photos and sketches and descriptive statements, the buildings were reconstructed and restored exactly like they were when General Johnston and General Sherman met for the historic conference. 2 20th century structures that resembled the original house were moved to the property. A smokehouse was constructed with leftover wood. The Day of Unity, April 29, 1962, was the 97th anniversary. More than 5,000 people attended the dedication and more than 10,000 toured the site during the first year. In 1975, a temporary visitor center was added, and then a permanent one was built. In 2014, Bennett Place Support Fund purchased 1.98 acres of the original farm, and the property is now 38 acres. In 1965, commemorating the centennial of the Johnston-Sherman surrender, Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey said, "We should always remember this lesson from the past. We must never permit the spirit of radicalism to poison the minds and hearts of the American people. This is the real lesson we can learn from Bennett Place." And then this, on the bottom here, this is a picture of the final terms that Sherman and Johnston wrote. It's a picture, and then because it's hard to read, the terms are written up here. And that's it. Any questions?